Well, I suppose in Ontario, Quebec, part of my responsibility had been the community services. And so I was always interested in the needs of people. In those days, it was called SAWS, Seventh-day Adventist Welfare Service. Later on, it became Seventh-day Adventist World Service. And while serving in the Union in the Congo, we had that opportunity as well. And I was involved. It was part of my work. But when I saw the terrific needs, and to be absolutely honest with you, the nuns in the Catholic Church would usually invite me to eat when we were in a village and they were there. And I noticed that they had food from CEDA, the Canadian International Development Agency. It was at that moment that in my mind I said, I'm going to make sure when we get back to Canada, we'll see that we can do something as an Adventist church for the people as the Catholics were doing. And so the call that we received was to the Alberta Conference. And Jim Wilson, who's now passed away, of course, said to me when I first arrived in Alberta, he says, "Now, John, I know we have given you these various jobs. One of them is health ministries. You don't look very healthy to me. I don't think what we want you to spend most of your time on is with the Alberta government finding projects to help in the third world." He said, "We know nothing about it. You've just come back. That's to be your top priority." So, I believe there's a God in heaven who overrules all things. And the very thing that I had hoped somehow I'd be able to do was demanded of me. How wonderful that was. And so as we started off, at that point, it was with the Alberta Conference. It then became Seventh-day Adventist World Services. And I noticed after working with the Alberta government and getting funding from them, first of all, what had happened was that Meredith Pond and Elma Littman were doing the ADRA annual appeal, which then was called Ingathering, in Edmonton. And they heard an announcement on the radio that the Alberta government was going to fund different agencies to do projects in the developing world. They told Lowell Cooper, who was the person I was trying to replace coming back. He was leaving for India, and his first project that he had with them was for a soya milk refrigeration unit in India. That was the beginning. And when I went to the government, they were so happy to see that the Seventh-day Adventist Church wanted to continue cooperating. And the project started coming, and we got as much as $500,000. And I noticed that many of the agencies were getting funding from the federal government. By this time, I'd been made the president of the Alberta Council for International Cooperation, which was the agency distributing the funds from the government. So I thought, why don't we get money from the federal government? And I asked the people in Oshawa, and finally it was permitted for me to go to Ottawa as long as they didn't have to pay for it. So I bought a ticket, went to Ottawa, and the first person I met was working in CEDA, the Canadian International Development Agency. And it was a very cold day, and he offered me a cup of coffee. And I was tempted to take it. I was thirsty. But I said, no, I don't drink it. And he said to me, my best friend is McKee, who has Little Debbie's. And when we eat together, he turns his coffee cup upside down. Now, he said, if you had drunk that coffee, you wouldn't get a nickel from me. But he says, you can bring any project to me, and we'll fund it. And before I left, there was about $90,000 in projects that we needed. And from then on, the Adventist Church in Alberta received funding as the Canadian branch of the Seventh-day Adventist World Services. Then in about 1985, the branch was renamed ADRA, the Adventist Development and Relief Agency, and the office was moved to Oshawa. That's basically a brief description of what happened. As far as Canada was concerned, we didn't do too much of giving people just food. We did food for work. But the main reason of our work was to help people help themselves. Maybe it was a fish project where they could grow fish and then sell them and have an economy. Maybe it was a garden project. Maybe it was digging a well so they had water for irrigation. It may have been training women where they could have a job and become independent. All of these different things. I think of one particular instance where we had a fishing project in the South Pacific, and it didn't matter if children or women or men, whoever brought the fish, they got the money. And it increased not only the amount of children that could go to church school because the funds were there, but the tithe went up 10%. It was quite an interesting thing. And so the name SOARS, Seventh-day Adventist Welfare Service and World Service, didn't actually explain what the church was doing. So the name was changed to ADRA, which is Development and Relief. The development part being where you help people to help themselves, but if there are disasters, say if there's a volcano, tsunami, or any of these things, the relief is needed, but the relief came second. And that's how the name change came about. First of all, of course, on an international basis, and then the different countries of the world have independent agencies like Canada. ADRA Canada was the Adventist Development and Relief Agency for that country. The Adventist Development and Relief Agency, its whole existence is there to help people who cannot help themselves. The main purpose is to give them an opportunity to be gainfully employed, to be able to manage their own homes and educate their children, to be healthy. Now, this is accomplished usually through either pure water, garden projects, or health projects. There are other things that are necessary sometimes, but basically that is the purpose of ADRA and why it exists. Many people think of development as fundraising in a university or college setting, but development, as one thinks of it on a worldwide basis, is to try and develop a person individually, physically, mentally, spiritually, socially, in those spheres. No person is isolated. Each part of a person is a whole. And ADRA tries to come in wherever it's possible. For example, if in China the Russians built a dam which raised the water level and many of the indigenous minority people lost all of their land, how can you help them rise above $10 a month income? They were below the subsistence level. We were able to put fish boxes there. The development for them was to allow the girls to use canoes, which the boys had made, dugout canoes. The older women sewed the nets, and the older men marketed the fish. By having these net boxes, they were able to raise their income to more than a government official's salary. You know, I kidded them. I said, "You guys over here, you're making capitalists out of these people. I'm not for this." And so what happened, I said, let's have a revolving fund. So that not only developing, there were 100 villages that were displaced by the dam. 10 villages we were helping. I said, why not put a percentage of the funds from the fish into a revolving fund and let all of the 100 villages succeed? And before I retired, 10 of the villages had an average income where the people could succeed. And visiting them in their homes, you could see what development actually does. It gives people dignity regardless of where they are. It allows them to feel they're useful. It doesn't matter if they're young girls, older men, whatever it is, all of them have gainful employment and enjoyment out of knowing they've done a job well done. And the donors who have given to ADRA can know that the money is well spent and not just wasted, it's actually used so that people can become self-supporting. when Jesus was here on earth, 90% of what he did was helping those in need. He saw the needs and then did it. Many of those people decided to follow him. Now, although ADRA doesn't have evangelistic meetings or things like that, I can recall up in a little village in Upper Volta where we had provided water for them. And my wife and I were there to have a look and see how things were going. And I'll never forget, one of the men there said, I'd like you to go over to the village. Our wives are waiting for you. So Millie and I, we went on to the village while the men were building the dam, finishing it off. And when we got to the women, they said, just wait a minute while we get dressed. We want to see you around the corner. Now, this was an area that was animist. There were no Baptist, Catholics, any denomination at all. And the women came out and they said, we want you to go visit in this church. I said, there is no church here. Oh, yes, we've built one. They said, we have prayed to our gods for rain, for gardens. We have got nothing. We've pled with our politicians. We have done everything we have possible. You people have come across the sea from Canada and given us the water we've wanted all these years. For 6 months, we've never had any. It's been dry. We want to worship the God that you serve. Will you tell us whom you serve? And they went in there and they sang a song. They had found a song from somewhere and they sang it. And it was the most beautiful music I've ever heard. No one had preached, but they wanted to know the God that we had served. I remember in China, I was up Mount Tai, the highest mountain east of the Himalayas. Madame Du was the government representative. We had 12 government representatives in the bus. And because Mount Tai was right near the birthplace of Confucius, we were asked to go to the top. At the top of Mount Tai, I saw carved out of the hill something that looked like one of the 10 Commandments. And I asked the translator that was with me, what is that? He said, that's the prayer of our third emperor. I said, can you tell me what it says? He says, oh yes, I read ancient Chinese. You're fortunate you have me. I'm a curator in the museum. He said, the third emperor is praying to the God of heaven who created all things to have wisdom to rule the people as wisely as the first 2 emperors. So when I got down to the bus, Madame Du said to me, what did you like best of the trip? Oh, I said, I like the prayer of your third emperor. She said, what's that? I never knew there was. And so I went to the translator. I said, can you tell Madame Du? He says, oh yes, the third emperor, he prayed this prayer. And she said, what was the prayer? And so he mentioned to Madame Du what I've just said. And Madame Du said to me, who is the God who created all things? I said, Madame Du, your third emperor worshiped the same God we at ADRA worship. She said, you do? Could you tell us about him? And I had the opportunity in the bus with those people to start in Genesis and go right through the scripture. There were 2 newspaper journalists sitting next to my wife in the bus, and they took notes of everything. And in the next day's paper, they put in an article about the God who created all things that the third emperor worshipped. No, we don't preach, but the Lord opens doors. And when we have to, we do tell. I have another story, but I don't think I should tell you, should I? But
I don't know.
This was Mr. Ma. He was a very stern man. And the first time I went to China, it was representing the Canadian government. There were 4 of us. And Mr. Ma said, I don't know why the Canadian government sent an Adventist minister. He said, you must never preach, never pray, never open your Bible. I said, I'm only here to help. I'm not going to preach. He says, okay. So they took me on the plane to the projects we had to see. And in that trip, the plane, it was just like a cork bobbing on the ocean. It was terrible. And Mr. Ma went from yellow to green. And he said to me, he said, you know, Mr. Howard, if you were to pray, do you think this would get better? Oh, I said, I'm sure it would. But I can't pray. I don't want to be thrown out of the country. I'm here to help you. 5 minutes later, the plane was so bad. The aisles were just slippery with people who tried to get to the bathroom and couldn't make it. And he just made a demand. He said, "Pray." And so I prayed out loud that God would still the air just as he had the waves on Galilee. And it calmed right down. We landed the plane, and Mr. Ma was still quite arrogant, and he said, "I want to show you the best waterfall in all of China, and don't you tell me that God created this. This is China's waterfall." And so I said, "No, God didn't create that. That happened because of the flood." He said, "Flood? What's that?" I said, "Well, it's in the Bible. I could tell you the story, but I'm not allowed to. If I show you my Bible, I'll be thrown out of China." Before the day was over, he was reading the story of the flood. And the last time we were in China, but one, Mr. Ma asked me, "What's the best way to learn English?" "Oh," I said, "studying the Bible." We were there before I retired with my wife. We turned on the television, and there was Adam and Eve on the television in the garden, and all the words were there in an English study. And I said to Mr. Ma, "Do you remember 10 years ago you wouldn't let me bring a Bible in, and now you're using the Bible to teach English?" He said, "You told me it was the best way. That's why we're doing it." So no, we don't preach. But whenever anybody asks, there's nothing wrong in telling what you believe and letting people know whom you worship, any more than it is to read whom the third emperor worshipped. The first one I want to talk to you about some of the successes that ADRA has had. One was one where the federal government, for example, said it couldn't work. And so I wasn't quite sure myself, but it seemed to be a good one. It was over in East Malaysia in Sarawak. And the project there was to try and keep the men at home. They were going down to the city, working, spending their money on liquor, and the women were having no success. They had no husband to raise the children with, and it was very difficult. So we had decided that if we were to have some ponds and raise fish, the men could raise these fish at home, sell them in the cities, and they'd be able to stay at home, help raise the children, and there would be an income for the wives as well as. And so we started this project, and I wasn't quite sure how it would go. But when we got there, we noticed that they had put chicken houses on top of the various ponds. The droppings from the chicken would go into the water, and the algae would form from the droppings. And the fish would eat the algae, so it didn't cost them anything to raise the fish. And they also got eggs. Well, I'm the kind of guy that wherever I go and there are fish, I see what the fish are eating. If there's a grasshopper, I'll flick it in the water. If there's a berry, I'll put it in and see if the fish eat it. Well, around these places, there was cassava. Now, in many of these countries, people just eat the root. And it is filling, but it doesn't have too much nutrient in it. But the leaves are very nutritious. Well, I picked a leaf which the people didn't eat, and I flicked it in the water, and about half a dozen fish came up, and they gobbled them down. And so the little kids saw this, and they would take leaves together, tie them up into a bunch, and throw them in the water. And the fish just ravenously ate these up. Well, we found after a year of eating these cassava leaves, the fish became quite big. And the next time we visited that particular area, we found that not only were the fish, but because of the water there, they had used the water to plant various food crops. There were papayas, there were mangoes, all kinds of things growing that couldn't have been grown without the water. The fish themselves were being fed the cassava leaves, and they were growing big. The cash crop made that the people could enlarge their homes, so the children had rooms as well as the adults, and the whole area really looked different from before and after. Yeah, it does make a difference, and they were on their own. They didn't need any more aid. They were able to continue. I can think of a place in China where the people were living in an area where the grass would not sustain any animal at all, it seemed. The cows wouldn't eat the grass, nothing was happening. And we found a kind of goat. It was a kind of a bantam type goat that liked this grass. And so we had a project where we would give certain goats, pairs of goats, to the people that were impoverished. And it didn't take many years before these goats multiplied and each family had sufficient money to subsist. They had the goats for milk, they had the hair from the goats to do various things with, and it was very, very successful. I think in Zimbabwe, in areas where it was very dry and we were able to provide wells where the people could have gardens. There was one project where within 1 year on 5 acres, over 100,000 Zimbabwe dollars was raised for an educational institution from the garden. That was a phenomenal experience. And I tell you, the food was good because I ate it. The tomatoes I loved, the cucumbers growing up and everything like that. There were instances I can think of in Kenya. I think of a school at Mutitu, right up on top of a mountain. Nobody would build a school for these people. The church institution said they had no money. The government said they had no money. So the mothers got together and formed a society. And I received a letter saying, all we want is water. We have anthills and stuff. We can make bricks, but we've no water. And so we had an opportunity of making water by digging a well. With that well, they were able to make the bricks, and that particular school was built completely by the local people. Now, when I was there the last time, it was with Jim Wilson, actually. He was there for a full council, and we went up there, and everybody wanted his hat. He had a hat that his wife had given him. They offered to trade it for everything. They would give him lots of money, the very things he wanted, but because Marilyn had given them a hat, he wouldn't trade it. He hung on to it for dear life. But what we noticed at that time was that every year there was one teacher who wasn't a Christian. And so I said to them, you say this is a Christian school. How come you have a teacher who isn't? Well, they said, we want him to see how we live. And at the end of each year, he seemed to accept. There was no preaching or anything. He just wanted to be with those people. And the students, the water that came from that well, they had to empty the water out so they could put cement around and bricks up. And as the water ran out, you know what the students did? They decided to plant seeds where the water was running. And by the time we got there, they had all kinds of food to eat at the school just because of the well. Not only did the well provide water to make the bricks, but there was water for a garden. And I was so encouraged to see local people with only a little bit of help from ADRA able to manage a school. I believe that ADRA is successful most of all because God has been in charge. He opened the doors. He wants it. It's part of the work that Jesus did when he was on earth. And even though there were difficult times, he has always led. Yes, the staff that we have. I remember when there was nobody and I really needed help so much. I can remember kneeling down in the office and asking, Lord, send me somebody. The next day, who should come but Kathy Anderson? Speaks fluent English and French, wanted a job, had trained as a secretary, and nobody wanted her in that position. The Lord did that. I remember Lisa Mercer when she first came. She was working in the conference office with a secure job, and she said, Elder Howard, what security will I have with ADRA? I said, none. The only thing I can tell you, if there's no money, I'll go without salary before you. That's all I can promise. The people that worked for ADRA were willing to put ADRA first. They were people who wanted to see those in need helped. They weren't thinking of themselves. And I could go right through all the staff. I don't have to do it because, there are too many. But this was right at the very beginning. Those people who started were willing to do it. Then there was a time when I was told that there was no money for ADRA. 6 months after we had moved to Oshawa and it was started. And the committee was to meet to dissolve ADRA. I received a phone call just a few days before from an individual at CIDA, the Canadian International Development Agency. She was not a Christian. She was from India, of another faith. And she said, John, I just want to tell you that the government they feel that you need more administrative money. You could have knocked me over with a feather. I said, how on earth did you know that? Oh, she said, you've been praying. I said, yes, I have. But you tell me how much you're going to give, and I'll tell you whether it's an answer to prayer. And she said to me, okay, and she named the figure, and it was the exact amount that was taken away from the North American Division. They had promised if we left Alberta, there would be salary for myself and my secretary and an office. After 6 months, they said there was no money, and the Lord provided. So I am certain in my own mind, for the whole time until I retired, never once did we not have enough money to pay the staff. We had no funding from tithe or any church funds from 85 until I retired. And in every month, there was money there. And in many cases, the Lord had, I feel, impressed people from outside that we needed these funds. So there's no question in my mind that ADRA is there by God's grace and is very much needed and will continue with the present staff. We're so fortunate that those that are there now have the same dedication as the ones that started. And each person that's working at ADRA today has that desire to help those in need. I just want to thank so much the donors over the years that have supported ADRA. As you know, the money that has been given in has been matched on an average 3 to 1, sometimes more than 20 to 1, but on an average 3 to 1. And every $100 that has been given ends up as $400, less about 5%, which we've taken for the administration, because the federal government gives us 7.5% for administration. The field that receives a donation gives us 5%, and the Canadian donor gives about 5%. So if you give $100, about $395 go to the projects. And I just want to thank each one that over the years has been faithful in helping other people to help themselves. It's made my work so much easier. And now in retirement, I don't have any worries because as Oliver Loftonbrook continues with his staff, the funds are used well. Everything has been done in a very systematic way. And I have no fear that the funds that are still coming in will be used to the honor and glory of God.